"This is too big." Rancher froze when he saw the giant bride bathing at the lake, Westromance. Witness this unbelievable, true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The air was golden that evening in Montana, the kind of late summer dusk where the prairie seemed endless and the lake shimmered like a sheet of glass. Rancher Caleb Morgan had been working since sunrise, driving cattle across dry land that never seemed to end, his shirt damp with sweat and dust. His chestnut stallion Ranger tossed its head, tired but obedient. Caleb had planned to head home before nightfall, but a faint splash from the lake caught his ear. At first, he thought it might have been a deer, or maybe one of the wild mustangs that roamed freely near the water. But as he drew closer, curiosity getting the better of him, he saw something that made him grip the reins tighter. The water rippled under the fading sun, and in the middle of the lake stood a woman. Not just any woman, but someone unlike any Caleb had ever seen. Her height alone seemed to defy reason, towering, broad-shouldered, with strong arms that looked as if they had hauled more than one wagon load in her time. Her hair was long, dark, and wet, clinging to her back as she lifted her hands to wring it out. For a moment, Caleb thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The sheer size of her presence, the way she stood in the water like some untamed goddess, it made his breath stall in his throat. "This is too big," he whispered under his breath, his voice barely carrying over the breeze. He wasn't sure if he was talking about her size or the way his chest reacted with a mix of fear and admiration. He had seen many women in town, prairie wives, ranchers' daughters, and saloon girls, but none like her. She was a vision from another world, too wild, too strong, too commanding for this rugged land, and yet perfectly suited for it. The woman turned, and Caleb felt as if the world had stopped moving. Her eyes were sharp, catching the light in a way that made them gleam. She didn't look startled, though she must have known someone was watching. Instead, a slow, amused smile touched her lips. "You've been staring long enough." "Cowboy," she said, her voice steady and low, carrying across the water. Caleb stumbled for words, pulling his hat from his head in a clumsy attempt at respect. I didn't mean no harm, miss, just wasn't expecting to see anyone here at this hour." The woman waded toward him, the water sliding off her tall frame, droplets clinging to her skin in the golden light. She emerged onto the bank with a blanket she had left nearby, wrapping it around her shoulders, though even with the covering, she seemed larger than life. Caleb realized he was still staring, but it was impossible not to. Her presence demanded attention. "Most folks don't expect me," she said with a faint smirk. "Name's Evelyn Grace." Caleb gave a small nod, his voice slow and measured. "Caleb Morgan. I own land just west of here. Never seen you around before." "I reckon you wouldn't have," she replied, her expression hardening. "I was promised to a man in these parts. Came all the way out here for him. But when he saw me, he turned pale as a ghost and rode off before I could say a word." Caleb's brow furrowed. He had heard of men running from danger, from debt, even from their own families. But running from a woman? That was a kind of weakness he couldn't comprehend. He studied her, the way she held herself even while recounting rejection. Her chin was high, her stance firm. She wasn't broken by it. If anything, she seemed more resolved. "I guess I was too much for him," Evelyn said after a pause, her tone dipped with bitterness. "Too tall, too strong, too big. Story of my life. Men say they want a wife who can work beside them, who can face the frontier, but when they see me, all they see is something they can't control." Caleb shifted on his boots, struggling with the words in his throat. He wanted to tell her she wasn't too much, that she was exactly what this land demanded. But he was a man of few words, and compliments didn't come easy to him. Instead, he simply said, "That ain't right. A man's a fool to walk away from someone who can stand tall against the wind." Her eyes flickered with something softer, a momentary break in her guarded expression. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, though her broad shoulders still showed beneath it. Caleb could feel the weight of her loneliness in the air, the years of being misunderstood, The sting of being abandoned once again. They walked back toward his horse, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. Caleb offered her a ride back to his ranch, but Evelyn shook her head. "I'll manage on my own." "I always do." That answer cut him deeper than he expected. He had been raised to respect strength, but he also knew what it was like to carry a burden alone. As she began walking toward the edge of the trees, he called after her. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice more firm now. "You're not too big. Not for this land. And not for me." She paused, her back to him, the setting sun outlining her frame like a giant shadow over the prairie. Slowly she turned, her eyes searching his face for mockery, for the same scorn she had always found in others. But instead, she found nothing but steady truth in his expression. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn Grace felt her heart stir with something other than bitterness. That night, the sky stretched wide above them, stars spilling across the black canvas of Montana's heavens. Evelyn sat by the fire Caleb had built, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She told him pieces of her story, how she had grown taller and stronger than most boys by the age of 12, how her father had taught her to break horses when no one else dared, how she had carried logs and driven wagons when her brothers fell ill. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with wonder or fear, never with understanding. "I wanted to be a bride like any other woman," she confessed, her voice breaking for the first time. "I wanted to belong to someone who saw me as more than a sideshow. But every time I get close, I see the look in their eyes, like I'm some kind of monster." Caleb stirred the fire with a stick, his jaw tight. He thought of his own struggles, how his land was often considered too barren, his herd too small, his life too modest. Yet he had made it work because he refused to give up on what mattered. Looking at Evelyn, he realized she wasn't a monster. She was a miracle of strength, a woman built by the same wildness that carved the mountains around them. "You're no monster," he said at last, his voice steady and low. "You're a woman carved out of the frontier itself, and any man who can't see that ain't worth the dust on his boots." Evelyn met his eyes, and for the first time that night a true smile curved her lips. It was faint, almost hesitant, but it was there. Caleb felt a warmth stir in his chest, a dangerous kind of warmth he hadn't let himself feel in years. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew one thing: this woman was not too big for him. If anything, she was exactly the size his heart had been waiting for. The fire burned low into the night, crackling softly as the stars wheeled overhead. Caleb sat across from Evelyn, watching the shadows play across her face. She had fallen into silence after sharing her story, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but heavy with thought. Caleb respected that. He wasn't a man who filled the air with useless chatter. He'd learned long ago that silence could say more than 100 words. Still, he felt the urge to speak, to give her something she hadn't heard before. But the right words were slow to come. She sipped from her tin cup, the heat of the coffee warming her palms, even as the night air cooled around them. Her broad shoulders relaxed for the first time since they met, and Caleb thought she looked less like the fierce giant who had risen from the lake, and more like a woman carrying years of exhaustion. He wanted to reach across the fire, to touch her hand, but he kept his fingers wrapped tightly around his own cup. He didn't want to frighten her off, or make her think he was like every other man who saw her as a curiosity. "You said earlier," Evelyn murmured, breaking the silence, "that I wasn't too big for you. Do you mean that, or was it just kindness?" Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His blue eyes met hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I don't waste words, Miss Evelyn. If I said it, I meant it. You're not too big for me, and you sure as hell ain't too big for this land. You're exactly what it takes to survive out here." For a long moment she didn't respond. Then to Caleb's surprise she laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but one filled with something rich and warm, like a creek breaking through ice after a long winter. "You've got a way about you, Caleb Morgan. You don't scare easy." He gave a faint smile, tugging at the brim of his hat. Life out here don't allow much fear. Fear gets you trampled by cattle or bit by a rattler. You learn to stand your ground. She studied him, her dark eyes softening in the firelight. Maybe that's why you don't look at me the way the others do. Before Caleb could answer, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Both of them turned toward the noise, their bodies instinctively tensing. Out of the shadows came 4 riders, their horses snorting and stamping as they drew closer to the fire. Caleb's jaw clenched when he recognized the man leading them. Roy Tanner, a rancher whose land bordered Caleb's to the east, swung down from his saddle. He was a lean man with a sharp face and a reputation for cruelty. Caleb had dealt with him before in disputes over grazing land, and each encounter left a sour taste. Roy wasn't the kind to fight fair. He was the kind who used fear to get what he wanted. Well, well, Roy drawled, his voice carrying across the firelight. Ain't this a picture? Caleb Morgan sitting cozy with the runaway bride. His eyes slid over to Evelyn, lingering with an ugly gleam. Heard about you, missy? Heard you scared the wits out of your groom. Can't say I blame him. You're a mighty big one, ain't you? Evelyn rose to her full height, towering over Roy even from across the flames. She didn't flinch at his words, though Caleb could see the way her hands curled into fists beneath her blanket. Her voice was calm, steady. And what business is that of yours? Roy smirked. Plenty of business. Word spreads quick out here. A woman left without a man is easy pickings. You'd fetch a fine price, work in kitchens, or haul in freight. Maybe even in other places. His men chuckled darkly behind him. Caleb shot to his feet, his hand resting near the revolver on his hip. His voice was low but firm. You'd best watch yourself, Tanner. This ain't your land and she ain't your concern. Roy sneered, his eyes narrowing. You gonna fight me over her, Morgan? Over this giant of a woman nobody else wanted. The words stung, but not for Caleb. He could see the way Evelyn's jaw tightened, how the old wounds of rejection reopened at Roy's taunts. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest, torn between anger and the need to shield her from cruelty. Before he could move, Evelyn stepped forward. You think I'm easy pickings? She said, her voice ringing like a hammer striking steel. She let the blanket fall from her shoulders, standing tall in the firelight, her frame casting a shadow that dwarfed Roy and his men. Come closer, and you'll find out just how wrong you are. Roy's smirk faltered. His men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their bravado shrinking under the sheer force of Evelyn's presence. She wasn't just tall. She was commanding, every inch of her radiating strength and defiance. Caleb's chest swelled with pride as he watched her. She didn't need saving, she never had, but he was damn sure going to stand beside her. Roy spat on the ground, his voice sour. You ain't worth the trouble. Come on, boys. He mounted his horse with a snap of the reins, but not before shooting Caleb a glare. This ain't over, Morgan. You'll regret sticking your nose where it don't belong. The riders disappeared into the darkness, their hooves pounding against the earth until the night swallowed them. Evelyn stood tall a moment longer before finally sinking back down by the fire. Caleb eased back into his seat, his pulse still racing. You didn't have to do that, Evelyn said softly, staring into the flames. Caleb frowned. Do what? Stand up to him. Men like Roy Tanner, don't forget. He'll come for you, for your land. Caleb's voice was steady. Let him come. He's been gunning for my land since the day his cattle grazed too far west. You just gave him another excuse, that's all. I ain't afraid of him. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and something inside her shifted. No man had ever faced down mockery on her behalf. No man had ever stood beside her without flinching at her size. For the first time, she felt not just respected, but wanted. You meant what you said, didn't you? She whispered. About me not being too big for you. Caleb leaned forward, his eyes unwavering. I meant every word. Evelyn Grace, you're not too big for me. You're exactly what I need. The crackle of the fire was the only sound between them, but the silence was alive, thick with unspoken truth. Evelyn felt warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. For the first time since she could remember, she felt she had found a place where she belonged, not in a town that whispered behind her back, not in a promise broken by a cowardly groom, but here, beside a man who saw her for who she truly was. The prairie stretched out endlessly around them, the stars their only witnesses. And under that vast Montana sky, Evelyn realized she wasn't just a giant bride abandoned at the lake. She was a woman who had finally found a man strong enough to stand beside her. Not beneath her, not in fear, but in equal measure.